Hey everyone, we're just getting started. We'll just give it another minute just to let everyone log in. Happy noontime, everyone. Happy Friday. All right. I have one more task that I have to push on one more button before we get started, and that will officially be underway. All right, I think we are in good shape. Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly O'Neill, and I'm the director of the Imperiia project at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And I am excited to welcome you to Degrees, Minutes, Seconds, where we attempt to convince you that history is even more interesting when you start mapping it. Today, we are talking about an amazing set of documents from the National Archives. They are the passenger records of 500,000 men, women, and children who immigrated from the Russian Empire to the United States in the 19th century. The records predate the Immigration Act of 1891, which essentially tried to bring a little bit of order to the utter chaos that was the immigration process. But the records we are talking about were definitely born in that chaos. So I have with me today a member of my team, Vivian Wei. Vivian, say hello.
Hi, everyone. This is Vivian Wei. I'm the research assistant of the Imperiia project together with Kelly.
Yeah, and Vivian is the one who authored a new edition of this immigration data that we are talking about. In fact, we just published it in order that all of you would be able to put it to great use if you want to. And so really, she is the perfect person to help us understand kind of what we can learn from it and give us a sense of its idiosyncrasies. So Vivian, I basically threw a bunch of really messy data at you and asked you to fix it, right? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how messy it was and really what it means when we say messy data.
Sure. Thank you, Kelly. And you are absolutely right. And not only the data set is messy, but every data set that have been processed before, I would say, contains some noises. And I believe it's essential to use data cleaning techniques to minimize the impact of those noises to ensure that the data is accurate and reliable for our future analysis. And then in the first step of our data cleaning process for this project is to screen the data for any like obvious errors and then inconsistencies from a standpoint. For example, we checked our missing data, like the last residencies in our data set, and also like incorrect data type, for example, like the redundant spaces in between our passenger IDs, and also like outliers such as the age of 999, which is obviously some outliers. And then also we checked the inconsistencies between like different data fields that I'm sure that we're going to talk about more, not only in this episode, but like later in the series, such as like the occupation, gender, first name inconsistencies. I think all those errors or inconsistencies in the first step of data cleaning process, they're very likely to affect the accuracy of data analytics. So like looking to the messy data set and then do this data screening step, I believe is really important. And I really enjoy this process. It's really meaningful for our future analysis.
Definitely. Just for the benefit of people who haven't spent countless hours working on this data set like you have, did you mention that there were passengers in the data set whose age was listed as 999?
Yes. And then those are for those like numbers that looks not reasonable, those are like months for like infants or child, so that we converted them into like real age later in the data process. But like in the first step of the data screening process, we identify them and red flag them.
Gotcha. Okay. So what would you say, you've worked with lots and lots of data sets in the past. This is not your first encounter with data at all. So what would you say are some of the major differences between, data that you've worked with in other contexts in your life, in your work, in your study, and historical data? Can you give us a sense of that?
Sure. I would say the messy nature of historical data, not only like our data set, but like all the data that we collected from a historical standpoint, makes our like data screening process like relatively longer than normal. I would have with like another data set that we collected contemporarily with comparable size. I think this is like reasonable because like the contemporary data or the data connected today is like in a sense more current and readily available due to advances in our technology, data collection methods, and then also it will be like faster if you look into like the collection period. While the historical data may be like more difficult to access due to different factors and methods and collection methods. For example, in our data set, we collect them with like pens and papers. But in the recent or contemporary like context, we would simply do like a Google form or some other form online, so that it is just one click. And one example that I would give is that in our data set, for example, we have each passenger as a line of record in our passenger table, and then all of them have a occupation. However, we like when I first do the screening, I saw there's a significant portion of our passengers have family relationship listed as their occupation. For example, someone may have mother or son or spinster as their occupation. So if these data are collected contemporarily or today, we can simply solve the problem by creating a drop-down list in an electronic form, and then just simply say that choosing from those options, so that we wouldn't have those family relationship listed. So I would say this is one example that I could give, comparing like the biggest difference between like the contemporary data set I used to work on versus this historical data set. But overall, I think it makes sense because I think that's why we're here, right? To process the data, make it more accurate, more complete,
and more usable. Right? Yeah. So that's really important, this notion that, these passenger records, they were assembled not at one moment in time, but over a period of almost a century. And each one of those voyages represented an instance of data collection. So the ship officer is standing there, trying to extract this information from every passenger on board. And I can only imagine that some of them are better at that than others. So the idea of consistency in the quality of the data capture, I mean, that just goes out the window when you're looking at records like this. So if we have data where in the occupation column, people have things listed like lace maker or farmer or bicycle maker or personal servant, maid servant, but you also have mother, father, daughter, these strange things in the occupation, category. Obviously, it takes a lot of work, but does it mean that historical data is bad data? Like, how should we think about approaching this? And is there like this distinction that, data produced now is really good and organized, and historical data is bad, and that's how we need to think about it?
I would say this doesn't necessarily mean that historical data is bad. As I mentioned, like in the beginning when we first started, all data has noise, right? Even if we collect them today, we would get a data set with more or less noises. And I can emphasize more about that noise is not a bad thing again, because from a data science perspective, if the original data set does not have any noise, like later on, if we want to build off like machine learning models or any kind of models based on it, it can cause some overfitting issues. That is saying like data set is only fitting, it only works well with like the data that we use, but once we have a model built and then apply it to, for example, to a later period of time, then it would not definitely like cause a lot of like inaccuracies. So yes, so I would say like having some noises, it would better model the reality.
Reality, yeah.
So this apply like the massive nature of our historical data set. I believe like by conducting our data cleaning process we mentioned earlier, we can lead definitely some like valuable insights into immigration studies, as well as provide like broader perspective on trends over time that does not necessarily like fit only into this period of time, but also like a longer time horizon. So, and again, I think this shows like the beauty and of course the potential of interdisciplinary research among like data science, GIS, and then of course Russian history. So I really like this aspect of the noise of the data.
I love that idea, right? That the missing pieces, the inconsistencies, what you might describe as inconsistencies or inaccuracies can be productive in the data. I think that that's a really great thing to hang on to, right? So in terms of what we can learn about immigration, you know, obviously immigration is a huge topic in the United States. Here, of course, in the present moment in this country, it's usually tied to conversations about the United States southern border, right, with Mexico. Although around the world, it means all kinds of other things. But the idea of people getting up and leaving their villages in the 1880s in what is now Belarus or Lithuania, traveling across Europe, piling onto steamships and sailing for New York or Baltimore, that might feel a little dated or a little bit just outside of our own contemporary understanding of immigration. So I'm wondering, is there a way for us to relate to the 19th century immigration experience? Like, can we sit there? Imagine we were to sit there, like all of you listening, imagine you are about to immigrate, right? You're standing at the dock in Hamburg, Germany. In your hand, you have a satchel or a carpet bag, right? The skies are gray, you know, your hands are cold. One of the things that I'm wondering about is the question, you know, am I all alone as I'm immigrating? Did people travel alone? Does the data allow us to know anything about that aspect of the experience of immigration?
Sure, Kelly, I believe the data will definitely tell us some story. But before like going into like a detailed story, I would like to briefly walk everyone here through our data set, just a very brief walkthrough. So in order, in our like passenger data table, there are 500,000 lines of records, and imagine each line of records represents a passenger on a immigration trip with information like their first name, last name, gender, the manifest, or say the trip ID, and then whether they're and what's their occupation, and then if a family relationship is specified, like we mentioned earlier, then it's a family relationship. But during my data analytic process, I saw a lot of passengers with the same last names, with the same trip ID. So that really makes me think about like compiling them at like a group, or at first I saw like since they have the same family name, I would put them at like in a sort of like organize them in a family level. So I made my first educated guess. Like Kelly, I'm sure that you will remember that we talked about this a lot, and then we finally decide to make an assumption that for those with the same family name and the same trip ID, we would assume they are from the same family. So that we first created a family ID by just putting together the last name and the trip ID together, so that we can like regroup our data at the family level. And then by looking at the regrouped data, we realize surprisingly, we find like incredibly large numbers of passengers in the same family, which is possible. Like the largest I could remember is like 131. Therefore, we revisit our assumption and made another educated guess, saying like if those travelers are in those large families, they're not necessarily like in the same family, but they should be sort of some kind of like related to each other. They might be relatives. So we redefined the group like by calling them travel group, and then the ID created, we're renaming them to travel group ID. So, and we did validation on our assumption by looking at the travelers in the same travel group. And we confirmed that for those ones from the larger families, they're from the same origin. And we could say that this is because we made an educated guess after we talked about like what we saw in the travel groups, is that for some of the in this data sets, they might not have a family name until they started or decided to start an immigration journey, so that they need their like ID, passport, if I would say they have that at that time, and also some sort of documentation that requires they have a last name, so that people from the same origin, for example, people from the same village, they would share the same last name, the same family name. So that's why we're seeing those larger groups, and we validate that by like looking at the travel group level and say these travel groups with the same ID are from the same origin. So we redefined our like family ID to travel group ID, as I mentioned, and then based on that, we made our analysis on gender distribution at the travel group level. So you can see it on my screen here. Among single travelers, so these are the single travelers. So if you're traveling by yourself, not in any of the travel group, then it's very likely that you're male, because the gender distribution for single travelers are around like 80 versus 20 approximately. So 80% you will be a male, and then 20% chance that you will be a female if you're traveling alone. But among traveler immigrating in groups, the gender ratio is about, I would say 50-50. They're evenly split. It like depends on like how many people within the travel group, but like overall it's like around 50-50. So I believe going back to your, and then we have this more like detailed statistics here listed. Due to the fact of time, I wouldn't go through it, but going back to your question, Kelly, from a modeling approach, we can definitely simulate the situations you described with statistics like we got here to build a Bayesian model. And simply speaking, a Bayesian model is a conditional probability that calculates the probability of a hypothesis, for example, that you talk about, like in our story context, like travel, and then with some other like informations, for example, the last name, the age, the gender, and the occupation, we'll be able to tell like it's more likely like if you're traveling alone or if you're in a group. And then, so overall, I believe, yes, the data would definitely tell us the story. And then again, Bayesian model is just one possibility how we can build the simulation. I believe like we could explore more since we already have this full data set published. We would definitely be able to build more of our data set. And I believe since we have a lot of like audience here today, the idea that like even though we published the data here, I would say the work is like never done, right? As we talk about, like that's why we're doing the live stream here today, is that in part we will need like everyone here in front of the screen to help us out to fill in the blank. Is your family listed in the records, and then can you provide more information so that we can add some like prior beliefs to our like statistical modeling process. So
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I mean, I love you pointed out the fact that at two ends of the data process, there are interesting things going on here. So, right, when the passenger records are being created in the 19th century, the fact that the people have to step on board the ships, that becomes the moment where they have to develop a new way of identifying themselves. And so surnames are invented or kind of taken on. So the very active, like in the data creation process, like personal self-identification is going on, right? It's such an interesting thing at that end. And then at this end, absolutely right. The data is never complete, right? There's always more we can know. So the active, all of your work bringing us to the point where we have, relatively clean, we have a relational database where people can actually use it, bringing it into data visualization tools and GIS if they want to, right? They can do all kinds of analysis, but they can also, there's an entry point for someone to come in and say, yeah, that is my family, and I know that town, and I can help you locate that town. So I love that iterative process, like an organic process of data creation and sharing. Really brings history right into the present, which is great. Yeah.
Kelly, and do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I know that you worked a lot on like the space area, right? So one question for you is that what does the data tell us about where these people were from or where they were going to? Any thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah. So this data basically tells us three things, right? We get each ship's port of departure, their itinerary, and their port of arrival. So we know the routes that the ships were traveling. And in terms of the residents themselves, the immigrants themselves, their last residence is supposed to be listed in the data. So those are the three kind of bits of spatial data that we get from this set of records. And on the one hand, it more or less confirms a lot of the things that we already knew about immigration from the Russian Empire at this time, right? So a very large percentage of the people who are traveling represented in these records come from what is now Lithuania, Belarus, and Poland. And they're coming from parts of the Russian Empire that were known as the Pale of Settlement, where Jewish subjects were allowed to live. And a large portion of the people in this database, we think, are likely Jewish. We also know that most of the voyages sailed from the Baltic, from ports on the Baltic Sea, the northern coast, with a lot of German ports, to New York. So this is not surprising, right? So it confirms a lot of things that we know. But what's interesting is that there are a lot of bits of outlying information that kind of fill in things that we don't necessarily talk about very much. So the records describe voyages not just from the Baltic Sea, but voyages departing from the South American coast and from Cuba, right? So there are subjects of the Russian Empire who have made their way there and are then boarding steamships to immigrate to the United States from the South, right? Which is a completely different kind of travel dynamic than we usually think about. We also find out that Russian immigrants went not just to New York City and Boston, but to Baltimore, New Orleans, different places. We find one of the interesting, to me, the most interesting thing probably is that while we find that most tsarist subjects are immigrating from the Pale of Settlement, there are a lot from Finland, there are some from Moscow, unsurprising places. We also find out, we see people coming from very distant parts of the Russian Empire, from towns like Astrakhan on the Volga on the Caspian coast, Orenburg, Baku, even Irkutsk, right? So we get this really broad kind of spectrum of people traveling across the Russian Empire to then leave the Russian Empire, travel across Europe to get to those ports, and then make their way to the United States, which is just an amazing voyage, right? Journey and voyage to undertake. And then the last thing I think I would say is that there are passengers who declared themselves residents of England and Scotland and Norway and Germany. So at the one time, they're announcing themselves as subjects of the Russian Empire, but then saying, my last residence is Aberdeen or London or, you know, Edinburgh, right? It's really, really interesting. And so what that reveals, and in fact, the most common city that's listed in the data as a last residence is Hamburg, Germany. And it's really interesting to me to think about what this suggests about how immigrants chose to identify themselves. You know, maybe they totally misunderstood the question. Maybe they chose to obscure their origins, but either way, the records really give us a good sense of the limits of what we can learn about the past, right? So it's, again, it's like you said, it's not about bad data. It's just about catching these really interesting moments in history where people are trying to figure out, they're being asked new questions and being forced to figure out how to identify themselves, which is just absolutely interesting. So there's so much more we can talk about, but we are about out of time. So I want to give you the last word, and just ask you to kind of share with people what do you want people ultimately to know about your experience working on this slightly crazy data set?
I would say working on this interdisciplinary research that combines Russian history and also like the spatial GIS, and of course data science. I would say I'm the coolest girl who covers CSC master program.
Okay, that's fantastic. I like that. So hashtag coolest girl, that's Vivian. Fantastic. To find out more about her project, about the work that she's done in the Russians in the World project, you can check out the link in our bio. Do you have questions? Do you have comments? Do you want to talk more? We would love to hear from you. You can write us here on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter at Imperiia Project, and we're easy to find online. And definitely join us next Friday. April 14th, I will be talking to another member of our team, Charles Flieger, about the work he is doing on a mountain of about 4,000 maps that sit at the Library of Congress, and we will introduce you to some of the gems and the quirks of that collection. So if you're interested in how the Russian Empire saw Ukraine in particular, if that's of interest, tune in. And thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you, Kelly. And thanks, everyone.